Good afternoon. I'm Richard Trifan. I'm going to talk to you today about some of the critical sustainability issues that the Silk Road program is going to be facing as it continues to evolve. There is much obvious construction needed, and there's a lot of technology needed, a lot of human capital needed. But specifically, I'm going to try to focus on the sustainability aspects, issues that may not yet have been planned in advance, since this is going to be a multi-nation initiative, but needs to be coordinated as one program. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, the goal being that the Silk Road infrastructure is obviously somewhere between the $3 and $4 trillion cost, and is going to be probably the one most expensive infrastructure ever put in place in the world, across several host nations. And the amount of coordination that's going to require is significant. So let's talk about some of these issues here. The capital assets on this scale are going to require succession planning. And succession planning, in the conventional sense, refers to job training or an ability of a person to be promoted in an organization. But this succession planning is going to be generational. Because obviously an investment of this size is not going to be retired and completely rebuilt after one's 20 or 30-year work career. So therefore, the succession planning has to include all the maintenance aspects, all the reliability of the total infrastructure aspects, and the performance of it from a customer point of view, passenger transportation, freight transportation, energy transportation, and information transportation. Those are some of the key areas where the succession planning has to consider new technologies coming in, new ways of working, new ways of traveling. So the maintenance efficiencies that we're talking about, the OpEx spend as opposed to the capital investment, can be reduced through very good degradation planning. And that being, when an asset is put in place, we already have to know exactly what its life cycle is going to be. So 20, 30 years in the future, we already know that asset's going to have to be replaced, and we already have a plan in place to do it. The infrastructure vendors' warranty stipulations are going to have to be built in to the maintenance strategies of all of these superstructures. Namely, the vendors from which these are sourced need to already be proactive in supplying some kind of warranted functionality for a certain period of years. Let's look at what those are. The rail guideway is the most obvious one, the actual right-of-way that's going to proceed down one or more of the Silk Road paths that have been defined. All of the signaling that's going to occur in moving vehicles, which will include not only rail vehicles, but also passenger vehicles, cars, trucks, and so forth. All of the signaling, whether the signaling is occurring along the right-of-way through all these countries, or in the vehicles themselves, or overhead signaling, or again, some kind of satellite communication, which is sure to exist end-to-end in this mode. The information guideways, I'm calling it, and that being how information will be transmitted. Not only information about the Silk Road itself, but arrival, destination times, estimated time of arrival, time of departure. All of this information, especially the commercial participants, are going to be looking for. The passenger guideway, the roads, the overland bridges, containing, over-the-road vehicles. And all of the stations, the stops along the way, all of the border facilities, all of the ramping on and off for vehicles that are going to be exiting the Silk Road at certain places in the countries, or after proceeding through several of the nations, or staying on till the total end journey of that particular path. Okay, linear asset boundaries and standards for each belt or road are necessary. And not only are they necessary, but big decisions need to be made by these host nation sponsors here. Namely, the International Standards Organization, the ISO. Is this going to be the baseline of the asset standard for the guideway and for all the traveling vehicles? Is it going to be IRIS? Is it going to be RSSB? Is it going to be CEN, CENELEC standards, or UIC? How will the geospatial definition of segments, provinces, and countries work? And again, not only how will they work at the onset, how are they going to be sustained as technology evolves, as new satellites are put in place, as communication frequencies change, because we're going to have to provide the Silk Road nations an unbroken business continuity. So therefore, the geospatial definition has to be, again, itself open to succession planning. Now, the strategy for construction is obviously one nation can take the lead, or several nations can collaborate through a international coordinated program, down to the province level and down to the city level, where the Silk Road is passing through known cities. There's also the aspect of cities or towns accruing and growing organically around the pathway of each Silk Road belt. The workforce for initial construction, again, can either be imported from, say, a primary builder, if you will, or it can be a local workforce that's utilized along each province of each nation, or a combination. And the knowledge transfer strategy is very important. The knowledge transfer is going to have to be somewhat preemptive at the beginning in order to impart the necessary sustaining skills to workforce that lives and works along the guideway, because the initial construction force can't stay in place indefinitely. So that knowledge has to be passed on, not only in paper form, electronic form, but also in terms of training and education. I'll get into that a little more in a later slide. So let's look at the total strategy for sustainability that we have. The design of templates to frame the sustainability parameters for each major asset type is mandatory by way of a program plan. The superstructures involved, the sub-assemblies involved, the physical assembly of the components, and the technological assembly of the components, again, for network reliability, information security, and information continuity. And another key aspect of the strategy is to align with the educational institutions that already exist along the chosen Silk Road paths, or the possibility to form new educational branches of existing schools and universities, again, to constantly be turning out people qualified to perform the sustainable maintenance, which is generational in nature. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, and just a few words about the fleet vehicles. First, let's think about rail. The standards, the operations continuity aspect of that, European Union standards, or Eurasian Economic Union standards, which has come a long way in the last couple of years. The International Standards Organization, which I referred to before, which is basically a British construct, or the French UIC, Union Internationale des Chemins de Fer, which is another European standard. Now, the Silk Road Standards Group can employ one or more of these standards, and obviously we look to existing pathways that span nations, such as the Channel Tunnel between England and France. We look for precedents for lessons learned and what is the best way to apply these standards. As far as the fleet, again, is concerned, there's going to have to be a significant reserve fleet in order to guarantee sufficient availability percentage to be able to hedge against any vehicle failures, breakdowns, and so forth, such that operations continuity is preserved. The international alignment is going to be necessary for all track gauge issues. As we know, there's a certain gauge in Eastern Europe, a different gauge in Western Europe, and the border where that gauge changes is different. So, but again, once one standard is chosen, then the vehicles that can be placed on the Silk Road will have to adhere to that standard. So the most efficient standard is going to have to be thought of in terms of transferring goods, products, services from one vehicle to another, how that will work. Let's talk about competition now. Now, in European Union, you have some precedents for this. You have Deutsche Bahn being a state provider of freight movement versus privatization of certain areas in Germany. So that's another model that's going to emerge here. Namely, each host nation, Tajik, Uzbek, Kazakh, they are also going to find there is a competition developing between state-provided transportation services and freight movement, passenger movement, or privatization, which offers obvious global input and inward investment, has its advantages, but may be harder to coordinate, such as England's network rail model might be one to look at for that. Now, how should the Silk Road nations between China and Europe manage the competition? Which is sure to emerge? Well, we don't know yet, but What we do know is a panel of representative nations needs to be formed to start discussing these issues. Because again, these issues are not going to come out necessarily in the initial construction phases, but they're going to come out later, once operations continuity is paramount and people and companies moving, again, goods, information, freight, and safety are expected from the Silk Road belts. And once they're expected, they have to be delivered. Composition and ratio of freight to passenger all has to be determined. That's obviously going to be flexed, but it's going to have to be flexed in coordination with an international schedule. So again, companies moving raw materials, moving finished goods west, moving raw materials east and west, going to have to be coordinated with passenger expectations. What kind of, are you going to have sleeper cars, dining cars? What kind of experience are people traveling this road going to be expecting? And once delivered, we're going to have to maintain it. Power. Not only is power, we have the full electrification goal, obviously, but there's always, of course, solar power is going to be developing over the next couple of decades. The maglev technology is already here. Can that be employed? Is there going to have to be stage sections of diesel power to get the thing going in areas where there isn't an infrastructure for, several hundred miles in between? We know that the electrical requirements are going to be significant, but we don't yet know how we're going to bring the power to the appropriate sections. And again, how will that power be coordinated and managed from a central location or some kind of a panel, representative group of these nations? I think education is probably one of the most key areas here, because for the belt of road to last or longer than its expected life cycle, and what I mean by that is components are going to age and need to be replaced at different intervals. So the whole thing is going to last perpetually, but how long is each aspect or each asset class or type going to last? Well, that's going to require local education, which is going to need to be offered at universities, secondary schools, technical schools, and so forth. And the question being, will each nation be able to provide an equal output volume of graduates who are ready to take on these maintenance responsibilities along this, 1,000+ mile corridor or several corridors? And you see what an immense responsibility this becomes. Because the contractor nations who are bidding on the construction are eventually going to pass the responsibility to another party or get into some other kind of a long-term service level agreement or SLA contract. What's needed is an asset lifetime commitment to maximize the capital investment. Certainly that's what the inward investors are going to look for at the various international banks, and the realized return on assets, again, on all the belts and all the roads. The parameters of the engineering technology has to dictate the training programs. Now, this link is known, but we're going to have to make sure that it gets applied, again, in a linear way all along the road's path, such that the efficiencies of getting the skills to the various sectors doesn't fail or doesn't cost more than has been projected in order to provide the return to the investors. Okay, so successive generations will need to receive this education to maintain each nation's section of the Silk Road. And there's a big impetus to these nations' opportunities now to develop their learning institutions to ante up and rise to this task. Also to conceptualize and maintain an overarching multinational infrastructure realization program and panel, as I said before, to make sure that the maintenance education keeps pace with the emerging technologies. As I mentioned before, you may have a diesel section, but if maglev can step in and provide that, or if other types of rail power or other types of vehicles, charging stations along the road, for example, the technology is going to be changing. So the education has to change and be ready in advance as the technology will change, as components of the whole guideway get replaced and updated as technology emerge. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, another aspect is the request for proposals. Now, in New York City here, we have a far smaller footprint, but the ability to put out the right proposals for the right skills, again, not only for initial construction, but for safety, security, information management, and to put out all these requests for proposals in the appropriate sequence and appropriate timing. This is a bear even in a project in one city or one country. Now we're looking at a project with more than half a dozen countries. So obviously it is an enormous task and requires enormous coordination. Should the RFP process be centralized, or should it be discrete within each nation with some kind of a panel, as I mentioned before, coordinating the timing of when vendors submit responses and again are ready to get to work? What will the evaluation standards be? All nations need to agree on these standards because every nation needs to feel that they're going to provide their portion of the operations continuity and safety that has been committed to. The linear labor along each section of the guideway is going to have to be evaluated again. Will they use mobility tablets? Will they be satellite connected and so forth? What nation should preside? Should it be the largest nation? Should it be the one that's most technologically advanced? Or should there be more of a kind of an equal lifting of all capabilities across all the nations, which might pose less risk in that sense? Warranties on road segments, which vendors will offer this, which ones won't? We don't know that yet because not all of these requests for proposals have gone out, and certainly not all vendors are yet in place. There's going to have to be some kind of multinational panel of evaluators for this material to make sure that what does get built and maintained provides the same standard from end to end, going as far west as England and going as far east as China, as we've already described. Investor financing, this isn't my expertise area, but I do know there is public-private partnership. Obviously, there's various international banking firms. There's also the need for a auditing panel to be able to advise on the quality of the investment, because as in any other investment, certain thresholds and hurdles need to be met, and this is no different. Of course, there is a certain elan in being involved in the Silk Road, but no investor is going to overlook their ability to realize a rate of return that's comparable to other investments they could be making. So on this panel, who's going to make the repair or replace decisions as assets age? This is always very critical because you're going to have multiple vendors, again, all tops, in their field. Should each nation maintain its own footprint? And again, or should each nation be at least communicating with its border nations to make sure that the large segments are maintained equally? So at no time is there one segment of the Silk Road in any of the belts that has a lower reliability or a lower safety threshold. This won't be permissible, and more than that, we have an opportunity to really design it well now if we think about these issues. Okay, next slide. Okay, the sustainable operations considerations that I've talked about are generational in nature. These are going to last longer than any one person's work life or any one person's natural lifespan. So they have to be generational, and this is a real commitment for these nations to consider making investments in aspects of the Silk Road whose return to those nations' economies, the ability to move raw materials more easily for conversion into finished goods, or nations to move finished goods more easily to their markets. This is an investment that will pay off way after these people don't hold those chairs, those offices. So it's going to require a real generational forward thinking here. The uptime of the whole pathway obviously is very significant. Let's look at some of these. The end-to-end satellite communication, GIS, or computer-based train control, which of course is very common now. It's going to have to be on every road at every point. When trains go into tunnels, are we going to lose satellite communication? We're going to use interpolation for positioning. All of these are going to become very important, especially not only for freight, but especially where passengers are concerned. Now, bridge and tunnel construction. When a bridge is constructed versus a tunnel, you don't lose satellite connectivity. This also has to be resolved. The technology is there for both, but these decisions become almost one of national policy for each one of these countries. Common languages. As the FAA has settled on English for the common air traffic control language around the world, what will the language be? It's another good point to think about now, because there's a lot of training that's going to have to go into this. Incident or accident resolution. should anything happen, there's going to have to be, again, a very well thought out plan, how something will be resolved, service restored, but appropriate responsibility assigned. Everything has to be planned for here. Now, monitoring the infrastructure's life cycle. Again, is it going to be each nation monitoring their own segment, or is there going to be a representative panel containing experts from possibly nations with no vested interest, may provide an objective view into evaluating the condition of each one of these segments, of the various asset classes that's going to have to make up, because it isn't only a highway, it isn't only a railroad, it's an information highway, and it's a whole guideway that's going to move people, processes, ideas, and goods and services. The fleet life cycle decisioning, that's another aspect of it, because as one fleet ages, needs to be replaced, will other vendors be able to bid? Will their specifications match what's already been designed? Succession planning as the propulsion technology evolves. That's another consideration, that sections may have to be rebuilt to accommodate new technologies for propulsion. And again, that should be planned in the education disseminated across the nations to make sure that local expertise and hands-on is available. Okay, so you've heard now, as a recap, some of the large issues to think about here. It's actually much easier to build something than it is to sustain it, especially when you have all the global aspects of safety, reliability, information security, personal safety, responsibility for goods moved, services provided along the route, the education to make those services affordable and sustainable. There is very much to talk about here, but in the time we have, I hope I've hit some of the high points. Thank you very much.